Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the low, smoky warmth of a Roman legionary fortress kitchen, somewhere along the Rhine frontier in the 1st century of the Common Era, where the air is thick with the smell of wood smoke and slowly boiling grain, and where the stone floor beneath your feet holds a gentle warmth from the fires that have been burning since long before the sun came up over the flat grey river plain to the east. The ceiling above is low and darkened with years of accumulated smoke, and the light that filters through the narrow ventilation gaps in the upper wall is the soft, pale light of an autumn morning, diffused and quiet. The kind of light that asks nothing of you and offers nothing except a steady, unhurried presence. Somewhere nearby, the low, continuous sound of a millstone turning fills the cool air with a rhythm as familiar and unremarkable as breathing, and the smell of freshly ground emmer wheat mingles with the deeper, older smell of the kitchen itself, of rendered fat and dried herbs and the faint, gentle sourness of Posca vinegar, kept in a clay jug beside the hearthstone. This is not a grand kitchen. It is a working kitchen, a military kitchen, built entirely for function and repetition, and the quiet, unhurried feeding of men whose day has already begun. The men who cook here are soldiers themselves, doing their turn at the fires as they do their turn at the walls. And it is that ordinariness, that quiet and relentless daily routine, that we are here tonight to rest inside together. The feeding of a Roman legion, that formidable military unit of between 4,800 and 5,500 men that formed the central and enduring backbone of Rome's military power from the reforms of the consul Gaius Marius in approximately 107. Before the Common Era, through the final collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 of the Common Era, was one of the most carefully organised, most thoroughly documented and most logistically demanding undertakings in the entire ancient world, and yet it was simultaneously one of the most thoroughly routine and repetitive. Every day, across dozens of frontier fortresses, permanent garrison installations, provincial supply depots, and marching camps stretching from the rain-soaked hills of northern Britannia in the northwest to the sun-bleached limestone plateau of Syria in the southeast, the soldiers of Rome's legions ate. They ate predictably. They ate in organised groups. They ate food that had been sourced and stored and transported and ground and cooked through a supply system of remarkable administrative complexity. And they ate according to patterns of diet and provisioning that changed remarkably little across several centuries of the institution's existence. Tonight, we're going to explore that world in careful, unhurried, and thorough detail. We will move through the granaries and supply depots of the frontier fortress, through the grinding rooms and the communal bread ovens, through the daily ration and its careful preparation, through the special foods of festivals and campaign marches and officers' tables, and through the extraordinary network of roads and rivers and imperial contracts that kept the legions of Rome adequately fed across 3 continents and many centuries. We will look at what the soldiers drank, what they seasoned their food with, how they organised their meal times, and what the written records of ancient authors alongside the physical evidence of archaeology have together revealed about the daily rhythms of eating in a Roman legionary fortress. Before we continue, a quiet and sincere word of thanks to everyone who has settled in with us tonight. If you are finding this a gentle companion for sleep or for study, a like or a share is always warmly appreciated. And subscribing to the channel helps others find this kind of calm and detailed content as well. We would genuinely love to hear in the comments which topics you would like to explore next, and we always wonder with warm curiosity where in the world you're watching from and what hour it is as you listen. Let us begin then with the absolute foundation of everything, the grain supply, wheat, emmer, and the foundation of the Roman military diet. It is worth pausing at the very beginning of our exploration to consider just how completely and thoroughly grain defined the diet of the Roman legionary soldier, and how fully the entire logistical, administrative, and physical infrastructure of the Roman military was organised around the challenge of acquiring, transporting, storing, and distributing cereal grain to the men who needed it. When we think of military food today, we might instinctively imagine a varied and protein-rich diet assembled from many different sources and delivered through a modern industrial supply chain. but the Roman soldier's daily nutrition was built, first and foremost, upon cereal grain in a way that shaped not only what he ate, but how his entire day was structured, how the legion's logistical systems were designed and managed, and how the broader Roman imperial economy was organised around the needs of its armed forces. The primacy of grain in the Roman military diet was not an accident of history, or a simple consequence of poverty. It was a deliberate and carefully maintained choice, rooted in the nutritional realities of the ancient world, in the extraordinary ease with which grain could be stored and transported, compared to almost any other food source of comparable caloric value, and in the deep cultural traditions of the Roman people, for whom grain and bread occupied a position of symbolic as well as practical importance, reaching back to the very foundations of Roman civilization. The primary grain ration issued to Roman legionaries throughout most of the Republican and Imperial periods was wheat, known in Latin as frumentum, and the daily allowance was substantial by the standards of the ancient world. The most carefully considered figure in both ancient literary sources and modern scholarly assessments is approximately 2 Roman pounds of grain per day for an ordinary legionary soldier on garrison duty, with additional allowances during periods of active campaigning or particularly heavy physical labour such as the construction of fortifications, roads, or siege works. The Roman pound, known as the libra, and standardised across the empire at approximately 328 grams in modern terms. These means that the standard daily grain ration amounted to something in the region of 650 to 700 grams of raw grain before any preparation or cooking had taken place. This figure, drawn in part from the detailed and comprehensive work of the scholar Jonathan Roth, whose 1999 study of the logistics of the Roman army remains one of the most thorough treatments of the subject available to modern readers, provides the essential numerical foundation for understanding the Roman soldier's diet and the supply systems that supported it. The wheat most commonly issued to the legions during the Republican and early Imperial periods appears to have been Emmer wheat, known in Latin as far, a variety of wheat that had been cultivated across the Mediterranean world since the Neolithic period, perhaps as early as 7000 before the Common Era in the Fertile Crescent of the ancient Near East, and that remained the dominant cereal crop of much of central and southern Italy, well into the Middle Republic before being gradually supplemented and eventually largely replaced by bread wheat, known in Latin as triticum aestivum, as agricultural practices improved and as the empire's most productive grain-growing provinces became fully integrated into the imperial supply network. Emmer was a hardy and reliable crop, well suited to the relatively thin soils and variable climates of many of the Mediterranean and sub-Mediterranean regions, where Rome's legions were regularly stationed, and it possessed the considerable practical advantage of storing very well in the sealed granary buildings of a legionary fortress. It is resisting insect infestation and moisture damage for extended periods, provided that the grain had been properly dried before storage, and that the storage conditions remained reasonably stable in terms of temperature and humidity. The granary buildings of a typical legionary fortress, known in Latin as horea, were constructed with precisely this long-term storage requirement firmly in mind, and they represent some of the most architecturally purposeful and practically sophisticated buildings in the entire legionary fortress complex. They were invariably built upon raised stone pillars or timber posts that elevated the floor several centimetres above the ground, allowing a continuous circulation of air beneath the floor that prevented the accumulation of ground moisture and inhibited the activity of rodents and insects that would otherwise have devastated the stored grain. Their walls were thick, typically constructed of mortared stone or fired brick, rather than the timber frame construction used for some other fortress buildings, providing both structural stability and thermal insulation that helped maintain a cool, stable interior environment throughout the seasonal cycle. Ventilation slots set into the walls at regular intervals provided a controlled flow of air through the building without admitting rain or excessive external heat, and the doorways were positioned and designed to minimise the entry of moisture-laden air during the wet seasons. The horea of the legionary fortress at Novicium, known today as Neuss on the left bank of the Lower Rhine, in the German state of North Rhine-Westphalia, were among the largest and most carefully studied examples of this building type, with individual buildings measuring approximately 60 metres in length and 12 metres in width, giving a total storage capacity sufficient to maintain the garrison's grain supply for several months, even in the event of complete disruption to the external supply chain. The scale of the grain requirement for the Roman military as a whole is a figure that bears dwelling upon with some care, because it communicates very directly the extraordinary logistical commitment that underpinned Roman imperial power in a way that abstract descriptions of military strength cannot quite capture. If we take a standard legion of 5,000 men, each consuming approximately 700 grams of grain per day, the daily requirement for that single unit amounts to approximately 3,500 kilograms, or 3.5 metric tons of raw grain. Over the course of a full year of 365 days, that daily requirement accumulates to a total of approximately 1,277 metric tons of grain for a single legion in a single year. Rome, at the height of its imperial power during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian in the early 2nd century of the Common Era, maintained approximately 30 legions in active service across the empire, which means that the grain requirement for the legionary forces alone, entirely setting aside the very considerable additional needs of the auxiliary cohorts and cavalry units that typically outnumbered the legions themselves, the naval forces, and the various administrative and support personnel attached to the military establishment, amounted to something on the order of 38,000 metric tons of grain per year. This was a procurement and transportation and storage challenge of a scale and organisational complexity that very few other institutions in the ancient or medieval world could match, and it demanded a level of administrative precision, financial investment, and logistical infrastructure that was, in many respects, the truest and most concrete measure of Roman imperial capacity. The grain came to the legions through many channels and from many provinces, organised through a combination of direct military requisition from provincial populations as a form of tax payment in kind, commercial purchase on the open market using funds drawn from the military treasury, and the management and output of imperial estates dedicated specifically to the supply of the armed forces. The province of Aegyptus, which Rome had incorporated as an imperial province following the defeat and death of Queen Cleopatra VII and the Roman general Marcus Antonius at the Battle of Actium in the year 31 before the Common Era and the subsequent occupation of Alexandria in 30. Before the Common Era was by far the most productive and most carefully managed single source of grain for the Roman military throughout the imperial period. The extraordinary fertility of the Nile Valley, renewed each year by the annual inundation that deposited fresh layers of rich alluvial soil across the floodplain, allowed Egyptian farmers to produce grain yields that modern agricultural historians estimate at approximately 10 to 15 times the quantity of seed sown, a ratio that was exceptional by ancient standards and that made Egypt the single most important food-producing region in the entire Mediterranean world. The organisation and management of Egyptian grain production and export was entrusted to a dedicated imperial bureaucracy operating from Alexandria, headed by the prefect of Egypt, a position of such strategic importance that it was reserved exclusively for men of the equestrian rather than the senatorial order, since an ambitious senator in control of Egypt's grain supply could theoretically hold the entire empire to ransom. As we allow ourselves to move gently forward from this foundational understanding of grain and its supply, let us consider next the immediate and daily process by which that grain was transformed from raw cereal into the food that the soldier actually ate, beginning with the grinding and milling that was the very first step in every day's food preparation. Grinding, milling, and the daily rhythm of the contubernium kitchen. There is something deeply and quietly rhythmic about the sound of grain being ground on stone, a low, steady, circular sound that carries within it the unhurried pace of necessary daily work, and it is worth pausing to appreciate that this sound was among the most constant and most familiar of all the sounds that filled the daily life of a Roman legionary fortress. From the first pale light of dawn, before the formal duties of the military day had properly begun, the hand mills of the individual contubernium mess groups were turning in the barrack rooms, producing the flour and coarse meal that would form the basis of that day's bread and porridge, and the sound of this grinding, then replicated dozens of times across the rows of barrack blocks that lined the interior of the fortress, was as integral to the morning soundscape of the military installation as the calls of the trumpeters or the tramp of the sentries making their rounds. The contubernium, which is a Latin word derived from the roots meaning roughly a sharing of a tent, was the fundamental social and domestic unit of the Roman legion's internal organisation, and understanding it is essential to understanding how food was prepared and consumed within the fortress. A contubernium consisted of 8 ordinary legionary soldiers who shared a pair of adjacent rooms within the barracks block, sleeping together in the rear room and using the front room as a combined equipment store, preparation space, and domestic area. The 8 men of a contubernium shared everything that pertained to their daily domestic life, their cooking equipment and utensils, their supply of rations, their fire or small hearth, and the various duties associated with keeping themselves fed and their shared space functional. This communal domestic arrangement was not merely a practical convenience. It was a deliberate feature of Roman military organisation designed to create bonds of loyalty and mutual dependency among small groups of men that would translate directly into military effectiveness when the unit was required to fight. Each contubernium was issued with a hand mill, known in Latin variously as a mola manualis or as a quern in the terminology of modern archaeology, which consisted of 2 roughly circular stones, typically fashioned from volcanic basalt, from the coarse-grained millstone grit quarried in various locations across the provinces, or from other suitably hard and textured stone types, with the upper stone rotating upon the lower through the application of a wooden handle inserted into a slot near the periphery of the upper stone. The diameter of these hand mills, as measured from the many examples recovered during archaeological excavations at legionary sites across the Roman world, including the fortresses of Caerleon in Wales, Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall, Haltern and Obereden on the Rhine, and numerous sites along the Danube frontier, typically ranges from approximately 35 centimetres at the smaller end to approximately 50 centimetres at the larger, with the most common examples clustering around 40 to 45 centimetres in diameter. These dimensions represent a careful balance between the grinding capacity needed to process the daily flour requirement of 8 men in a reasonable period of time, and the practical portability demanded of equipment that might need to be transported on campaign. The process of grinding grain on a rotary hand mill was physically straightforward in its mechanics, though it required a certain degree of skill and experience to execute efficiently and to produce flour of consistently acceptable quality. The soldier operating the mill would pour a measured quantity of grain, drawn from the contubernium's share of the official ration, into the central feed hole of the upper stone, a roughly funnel-shaped opening through which the grain fell into the gap between the 2 grinding surfaces. He would then rotate the upper stone continuously against the lower, either pushing and pulling the handle in a steady circular motion while seated beside the mill, or, for extended sessions of grinding, standing and leaning into the handle, with the weight of his body to provide more consistent force. The grain, once it entered the grinding gap, was progressively crushed and abraded as it moved outward under centrifugal force toward the outer edge of the stones, falling as flour or coarse meal into a collecting cloth or shallow vessel arranged beneath the mill to catch the product. The rate of production from a mill of this type, as estimated through the careful experimental work of archaeologists and reenactors who have operated replica mills of the appropriate dimensions, was approximately 1 to 2 kilograms of flour per hour of continuous operation, suggesting that grinding the daily flour ration for 8 men, perhaps 4 to 5 kilograms of flour in total, would have required something between 2 and 4 hours of grinding work distributed across the members of the group. The quality of the flour produced by a hand mill of this type was significantly different from the refined white flour familiar to modern bakers and consumers. It was a coarser product, typically ranging from a rather gritty and uneven meal at one extreme to a moderately fine flour at the other, depending upon the care taken in operation and the condition of the grinding surfaces, and it retained a substantial proportion of the bran and germ of the original grain, giving it a greyish-brown colour and a distinctly grainy texture that would be immediately apparent to anyone accustomed to modern refined flour. The flour also, unavoidably, contained small quantities of grit and mineral particles abraded from the surface of the millstones during the grinding process, a contaminant that was essentially impossible to eliminate entirely and whose effects over a lifetime of consumption were clearly visible in the skeletal remains of Roman soldiers examined by modern forensic specialists. The teeth of Roman legionaries, preserved in burials associated with military sites across the empire, show characteristic patterns of wear on the molar and premolar teeth that are entirely consistent with a diet containing significant quantities of abrasive grit, yet wear patterns that are substantially more pronounced than those found in populations whose diet was based upon more finely processed grain or upon softer foods. The individual contubernium hand mill was not the only milling option available within a fully established legionary fortress, particularly during the middle and later imperial periods, when permanent installations had developed the infrastructure to support more efficient communal grinding. Larger rotary mills powered by animals, typically donkeys or mules, known in Latin as molae acineariae, could process grain many times faster than the individual hand mill, and they are attested at a number of legionary and auxiliary fort sites through the discovery of their characteristic large millstones, which are distinguished from hand millstones primarily by their greater diameter, are typically between 60 and 90 centimetres, and by the evidence for a central driving mechanism of greater complexity than the simple hand handle of the smaller type. Water-powered mills, known as molae aquaria, represented the most sophisticated end of the Roman milling technology spectrum, and while their deployment within individual legionary fortresses was probably less universal than the animal-powered mill, their existence within the broader Roman military supply zone is clearly demonstrated by the extraordinary example at Barbegal near Arlete, the modern French city of Arles, in the province of Gallia Narbonensis, where a cascade of 16 individual water wheels arranged in 2 parallel rows descending a natural hillside could, when operating at full capacity, grind a quantity of grain estimated by modern hydraulic engineers at approximately 4.5 tons per day, more than sufficient to supply the entire bread requirement of a small city or a large military garrison. The flour and meal produced by whatever combination of milling methods was available to the contubernium was then used in the preparation of the soldiers' daily food, and the range of preparations into which it was transformed was somewhat wider than might immediately be supposed. The simplest and most ancient preparation was porridge, known in Latin as pulse or pulmentum, made by mixing the ground grain with water and salt, and boiling the mixture over the contubernium fire until it thickened to the desired consistency. This pulse was the ancestral food of the Roman people, the dish that Roman literary tradition associated most directly with the simple virtues of the early republic, and it remained a staple of military cooking throughout the army's history, even as bread became the more prestigious and perhaps more common daily form. And so, turning our attention quietly forward, let us consider the bread itself and the many forms it took in the legionary soldier's daily experience: bread, biscuit, and the baking traditions of the legionary fortress. The bread of the Roman legionary soldier was, in the most literal sense, his daily bread, the food upon which his physical strength and his daily caloric intake most fundamentally depended, and the making of that bread, from the grinding of the grain through the mixing of the dough to the management of the barrack ovens, was a routine of such constancy and regularity that it structured the entire rhythm of the soldier's domestic day in a way that no other single activity could quite match. The Roman military bread tradition was ancient, practical, and remarkably diverse in its specific forms, ranging from the soft, leavened loaves of the permanent garrison kitchen at one end of the spectrum to the iron-hard, desiccated campaign biscuit at the other, with a range of intermediate preparations adapted to the particular circumstances of daily military life filling the space between these two extremes. The standard garrison bread of the Roman legion, baked in the Klebanus ovens built into or against the walls of the legionary barrack blocks, was a round, flat-bottomed loaf of modest dimensions, similar in its general form to the loaves familiar from the extraordinary archaeological evidence preserved by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius on the 24th day of August in the year 79 of the Common Era. The volcanic catastrophe that overwhelmed the towns of Pompeii, Herculaneum and Stabiae on that day, burying them beneath several metres of volcanic ash and pumice in a matter of hours, was one of the greatest human disasters of the ancient world. But it was also, here in a deeply paradoxical way, one of the most remarkable preservation events in the entire history of archaeology. freezing an ordinary Roman town in a single moment of daily life with a completeness and a detail that no deliberate excavation could have achieved. Among the many categories of evidence preserved by the eruption, the contents of Pompeii's bakeries are particularly striking, and the carbonized loaves discovered in the excavation of bakeries along the Via dell'Abbondanza and in other parts of the city provide direct and unambiguous evidence of the form, size, and construction of Roman bread in the 1st century of the Common Era. The most celebrated of these preserved loaves, a round carbonized object approximately 20 centimetres in diameter and perhaps 5 centimetres in height, and are divided into 8 roughly equal segments by a series of incised cuts made in the dough before baking, and bearing the impressed stamp of its baker, was found in a bakery excavated in the early years of the 19th century, and is now preserved in the collection of the Museo Archeologico Nazionale in Naples, where it has been one of the most enduringly evocative objects in the museum's extraordinary collection for nearly 2 centuries. This specific loaf was a civilian product from a commercial bakery rather than a military ration bread, but its form and dimensions are entirely consistent with the bread known from other sources to have been produced in military contexts, and the practice of dividing the round loaf into segments before baking, which facilitated easy breaking and sharing among a group of men, is well suited to the communal eating arrangements of the contubernium. The leavening of Roman bread is a topic of considerable interest and some scholarly discussion. The production of a well-risen, light-textured loaf requires the presence of active yeast organisms capable of fermenting the sugars in the flour and producing carbon dioxide gas, which becomes trapped within the developing gluten structure of the dough and causes it to expand before the heat of the oven sets the structure in its risen form. Roman bakers were not able to purchase commercial yeast in the form of the carefully cultivated and packaged products available to modern bakers, but they were thoroughly familiar with the practical phenomenon of fermentation and had developed a range of techniques for introducing active wild yeasts and lactic acid bacteria into their bread doughs. The most common and most practical of these techniques was the maintenance of a sourdough starter culture, a mixture of flour and water that had been allowed to ferment over several days until it was colonized by the wild yeasts and bacteria naturally present in the grain, the flour, and the air of the bakery, and which was then maintained indefinitely by regular refreshment with fresh flour and water. A small portion of this active starter culture, incorporated into a fresh batch of dough, would cause the dough to rise over several hours of fermentation before baking, producing a bread with the characteristic slightly sour flavour and moderately open crumb structure of a well-made sourdough loaf. For the Roman soldier on the march, or in any circumstances where the permanent fortress ovens were unavailable, the alternative to freshly baked leavened bread was the campaign biscuit known as bucellatum. This product, one of the most practically important foods in the entire Roman military diet, was made from flour, water, and salt mixed into a stiff dough, formed into small, flat, round shapes, and baked at a moderate temperature for an extended period designed to drive out the maximum possible proportion of the product's moisture content. The result was a food of extraordinary hardness and durability, almost completely impervious to the mould, insect infestation, and bacterial spoilage that would quickly render ordinary bread inedible, and capable of being stored and transported for weeks or even months without significant deterioration of its nutritional value. The hardness of bucellatum was such that it could not comfortably be eaten directly by most people, requiring either the vigorous physical effort of breaking it apart with the hands and grinding it between the teeth, an activity that caused the kind of dental wear discussed in the previous section, or the more comfortable alternative of soaking it in water, wine, posca, or the soldier's daily liquid ration until it softened to a more manageable consistency. The 4th century Latin military writer Publius Flavius Vegetius Renatus, known simply as Vegetius, whose work The Epitome Re Militaris is one of the most important surviving texts on Roman military organisation and doctrine, specifically recommends in his discussion of fortress provisioning that the garrison should at all times maintain a reserve of bucellatum sufficient to sustain the soldiers for a minimum of 3 months against the possibility of siege, supply disruption, or other emergency, a recommendation that speaks eloquently to both the durability and the practical importance of this form of military bread in the thinking of late Roman military administrators. Alongside the formal leavened garrison loaf and the campaign biscuit, Roman soldiers also prepared simpler forms of unleavened flatbread on an everyday basis, using nothing more elaborate than a flat stone, a ceramic tile, or an iron griddle plate heated over an open fire. This kind of simple flatbread, made from a mixture of flour and water pressed into a thin round shape and cooked quickly on the hot surface, required no rising time, no oven, and no leavening agent of any kind, and could be produced in a matter of minutes by any soldier with access to flour, water, and a fire. It was almost certainly a constant feature of daily life in the contubernum, prepared as a quick supplement to the formal daily bread ration, or as a replacement for it in circumstances where the ovens were occupied or unavailable, and its very simplicity and ubiquity are probably the main reasons why it leaves so little specific trace in the literary sources, which tend to describe the exceptional rather than the entirely ordinary. As we carry this understanding of the soldier's daily bread forward into our exploration, let us turn now to the equally important world of the flavourings and liquid rations that gave the bread and porridge their taste: salt, olive oil, posca, and vinegar, the essential flavourings of the military kitchen. If grain and bread formed the absolute structural foundation of the Roman legionary soldier's daily diet, providing the bulk of his caloric intake and the central substance around which every meal was organised, then the small but essential range of flavouring and liquid ration items that accompanied the grain gave that diet its character, its palatability, and much of its nutritional completeness. These items, which in the official supply documents and the accounts of ancient writers appear almost as afterthoughts beside the vast quantities of grain that dominated every discussion of military provisioning, were in practice as carefully managed and as systematically distributed as the grain itself, and their absence, even briefly, could reduce the soldier's daily food from something tolerable and sustaining to something genuinely miserable and demoralising. The most fundamental of these accompaniments was salt, followed closely by olive oil, the sour wine mixture known as posca, and the fermented wine vinegar known as acetum. And together these four items defined the baseline flavour experience of Roman military cooking in a way that was as consistent and as universal across the empire as the grain ration itself. Salt, known in Latin as sal, was so deeply embedded in Roman military and civilian life that its importance is almost impossible to overstate. It was a flavouring and a preservative of absolute necessity, essential not only to making food palatable, but to the entire system of food preservation that allowed the Roman military supply chain to function across the vast distances and extended time periods that characterized the management of a frontier army. Without salt, the salted fish, the cured pork, the preserved olives, and the many other non-perishable food items that formed such an important part of the military ration could not be produced, stored, or transported. The soldier's daily ration of salt was issued as a matter of routine, and the cultural memory of this practice is preserved in the Latin language itself through the word salarium, the term from which the modern English word salary ultimately derives. The salarium referred originally either to the salt allowance provided directly to Roman soldiers, or to the money paid specifically for the purpose of purchasing salt, and in either interpretation it speaks to the absolute centrality of salt in the economic and nutritional life of the Roman military. The production of salt in the Roman world drew upon a variety of sources distributed across the empire, each with its own characteristic methods and products. The most ancient and most important source for the city of Rome itself was the salt pans at the mouth of the Tiber River, the Salinae Ostiae, accessible via the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, one of the oldest roads in Italy, which ran from Rome to the Adriatic coast through the Sabine Hills, and whose name directly commemorates its original function as a route for the transport of salt. Then coastal salt pans of this type, where shallow lagoons of seawater were evaporated by the sun and wind to leave deposits of crystalline salt, were found throughout the Mediterranean provinces and supplied the bulk of the salt consumed by the legions of the southern and eastern frontiers. The legions of the Rhine and Danube frontiers, located deep in the continental interior far from the Mediterranean coast, were served by a different network of salt sources, primarily the brine springs of the Alpine foothills and the salt deposits of the Hallstatt region in what is now Austria, whose exploitation long predated the Roman presence in these areas, and which the Romans systematically developed and expanded to meet the needs of their frontier garrisons. Olive oil occupied a position in the Roman military kitchen that was in some respects even more versatile and more pervasive than that of salt. It functioned simultaneously as a cooking medium, a condiment added directly to food at the table, a lamp fuel that illuminated the barracks rooms through the long northern nights, a skin conditioner used by soldiers after bathing or exercise, and a medicinal substance employed in the treatment of wounds, skin conditions, and a variety of internal ailments. The best grades of olive oil, pressed from freshly harvested green olives before they had begun to oxidize, were light in colour, mild in flavour, and highly prized in the civilian market, commanding prices that put them well beyond the reach of ordinary soldiers. The olive oil issued as part of the military ration was a product of more modest quality, pressed from riper olives and carrying a fuller, more robust flavour, with a perceptible degree of bitterness and pungency, but perfectly serviceable for all the cooking and flavouring purposes to which it was put in the military kitchen. The primary production regions for the olive oil that supplied the Rhine and Danube frontier legions were the olive-growing areas of Hispania Baetica, the fertile river valley of the Guadalquivir in what is now the Andalusia region of southern Spain, and the olive groves of North Africa, both of which produced oil in enormous quantities and distributed it through commercial networks of remarkable reach and efficiency. The Posca ration was issued to every legionary soldier as his standard daily drink, and it consisted of a mixture of sour wine or acetum, wine vinegar, diluted with water in proportions that probably varied according to the strength of the base product and the preferences of the individual. Posca was not, by any modern standard of palatability, a pleasant drink. It was sharp and acidic and distinctly sour, made from wine that had turned beyond the point of being acceptable as table wine, or from the deliberate further fermentation and oxidation of wine to produce vinegar. But it was practical and, in a military context, valuable in ways that went beyond its modest flavour. The acidity of Posca, produced by its content of acetic acid and various other organic acids derived from the fermentation process, provided a degree of antimicrobial activity against certain waterborne pathogens, making it a meaningfully safer choice than drinking raw water in regions where the water supply was of uncertain quality. It was also a source of vitamin C, derived from the residual grape content of the base wine, and this contribution to preventing scurvy was practically important during extended campaigns or sieges, when the soldiers' access to fresh fruit and vegetables was severely limited. The use of acetum, the pure wine vinegar component of Posca, extended well beyond the preparation of the daily drink ration. It was used as a cooking acid in the preparation of sauces and braises, where its sharp flavour balanced the richness of meat and fish dishes, and it was the essential liquid component of the various garum-based sauce preparations that form the backbone of Roman culinary flavouring. It was also used medicinally, as an antiseptic for wounds and a treatment for various digestive complaints, and its presence in the military kitchen was therefore relevant not only to the preparation of food, but to the broader maintenance of the soldier's health and physical condition. And so, carrying with us this understanding of the essential flavouring materials that shaped every meal in the legionary kitchen, let us turn our attention to the more substantial protein foods that rounded out the soldier's daily nutritional picture: meat, fish, and legumes, the protein foundations of the Roman soldier's diet. The question of how much meat the Roman legionary soldier ate, and of what kinds, has been one of the most productively debated and most thoroughly revised topics in the scholarly literature on Roman military diet over the past 4 decades, and the evidence bearing upon it has grown substantially in both volume and precision as archaeological science has developed the methods needed to extract meaningful dietary information from the physical residues of ancient military life. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the scholarly consensus held that the Roman legionary's diet was essentially or largely vegetarian, built primarily upon grain and legumes, with meat playing at most a minimal or ceremonial role. This view found apparent support in the testimony of certain ancient literary sources, in the obvious primacy of grain in every discussion of military provisioning, and in a tendency among some earlier scholars to project onto the Roman army a model of austere, grain-based simplicity that said as much about their own assumptions regarding ancient poverty as it did about the historical evidence. The systematic zooarchaeological analysis of animal bone assemblages from legionary fortress sites, a discipline that developed its full methodological rigour only in the latter decades of the 20th century, has replaced this picture with something considerably more nuanced and more interesting. The animal bone assemblages recovered from the refuse deposits and kitchen middens of legionary fortress sites across the Roman world present a consistent and revealing picture when analysed using the full suite of modern zooarchaeological methods, including minimum numbers of individuals calculations, skeletal element representation analysis, butchery mark identification, and the aging of animals at slaughter through dental and epiphyseal fusion evidence. The most consistently present and most numerically significant species in these assemblages are cattle, pig and sheep and goat, in proportions that vary somewhat from site to site and period to period, but that collectively indicate a meaningful and regular contribution of meat to the ordinary soldier's diet. Well beyond what could be explained by occasional ceremonial or festive consumption alone, cattle bones are typically the most abundant in terms of meat weight represented, reflecting both the large size of the individual animal and the apparently significant role of beef in the military diet, particularly in the Rhine and Danube frontier provinces, where cattle were a well-established element of the local agricultural economy, and where the conditions were well suited to maintaining large herds in the proximity of the military installations. Pork held a special position in the Roman culinary tradition that was expressed as clearly in the military context as in civilian Roman society more broadly. The pig was the most celebrated and most versatile of Roman domesticated meat animals, valued for the extraordinary diversity and quality of the food products obtainable from a single carcass, from the fresh joints that could be roasted or braised on feast days, to the preserved products, salted bacon, smoked ham, dried sausages, and cured offal that could be stored for months and eaten as everyday accompaniments to the grain ration. Roman culinary literature is full of enthusiasm for pork in all its forms. The Apicius Cookbook, the most complete surviving collection of ancient Roman culinary recipes, devotes substantial sections to pork preparations of every conceivable kind, from simple roasted joints seasoned with cumin and pepper to elaborate preparations of liver and kidney in complex sauces, and from stuffed and braised pig's trotters to sophisticated sausages incorporating pine nuts, aromatic herbs, and wine-soaked bread. The bone assemblages from legionary sites confirm this literary enthusiasm with physical evidence, showing that pig carcasses were processed and consumed at every legionary site examined, and that both the primary joints and the secondary cuts were utilised. Fish and fish-derived products were perhaps even more consistently present in the Roman military diet than any category of fresh meat, primarily because of the ease with which fish could be preserved for long periods through salting, drying and fermentation, making them ideal components of a supply system that needed to move food over great distances and store it for extended periods. The most important single fish product in the Roman military kitchen was garum, the fermented fish sauce whose production, distribution, and culinary use was so thoroughly integrated into every aspect of Roman food culture that it will receive its own dedicated section in our exploration. Alongside garum, the soldiers received regular rations of dried and salted fish, the most common types being small pelagic species such as anchovies, sardines and mackerel that were available in enormous quantities in the Mediterranean, the Atlantic coast of Iberia and the Black Sea region. These small salted fish were packed into amphorae or ceramic jars with layers of salt and distributed through the same supply networks as olive oil and wine, arriving at the frontier fortresses in a state that could be eaten directly, soaked in water to reduce the saltiness, or incorporated into cooked preparations. The contribution of legumes to the Roman military diet deserves careful attention, both for their nutritional importance and for their practical advantages as a supply item. The main legumes consumed by Roman soldiers included lentils, chickpeas, various species of bean including the broad bean or fava bean known in Latin as faba, and peas. These crops were nutritionally complementary to the grain ration in a technically precise biochemical sense, since the proteins of cereal grains and legumes contain different profiles of essential amino acids, and the combination of the two in the diet provides a more complete and more nutritionally adequate protein supply than either alone. Lentils in particular were a staple of the Roman diet at all social levels, and were specifically associated in Roman literary tradition with simple, wholesome, unpretentious eating, a cultural valuation that made them a natural and well-accepted component of military provisioning. Lentil soup, prepared by simmering dried lentils in water, with olive oil, salt, and whatever aromatics were available, was almost certainly one of the most common everyday dishes in the legionary kitchen, and the ease with which lentils could be cooked, their long shelf life in dried form, and their excellent nutritional value made them an ideal military ration item in ways that the supply administrators of the Roman army clearly recognised and exploited. And with a full sense of the protein picture established, let us turn now to the remarkable supply system that brought all these foods to the soldier's table, the Annona Militaris, roads, rivers, and the Roman military supply system. The feeding of Rome's legions across an empire spanning 3 continents and some 4 million square kilometres at its greatest extent required a supply system whose organisational complexity, physical infrastructure, and administrative sophistication had no real parallel in the pre-modern world, and whose study, drawing upon a rich and diverse body of evidence, including imperial edicts and legal texts, military papyri from Egypt, the extraordinary writing tablets from Vindolanda, inscriptions recording the careers of supply officers, and the physical remains of roads, warehouses, river ports, and granaries identified by archaeologists across the length and breadth of the former empire, reveals an institution of remarkable capability and, when functioning well, remarkable efficiency. The formal name most commonly applied to the system by which the Roman state supplied its military forces with food and other essential materials is the Annona Militaris, a term derived from the Latin word annona, which denoted the annual grain supply of the city of Rome, and was extended by analogy to the organised provisioning of the army as a whole. The physical backbone of the Roman military supply system was the road network, and it is impossible to discuss the logistics of military provisioning without first acknowledging the extraordinary achievement represented by the Roman road as a piece of engineering and as a piece of administrative infrastructure. The Roman road network at its greatest extent encompassed approximately 80,000 kilometres of properly surveyed, graded and surfaced highway, with an additional and substantially larger network of secondary roads and tracks connecting smaller communities, farms and military posts to the main arterial routes. The primary roads, the Viae Publicae or public roads, were built to a consistent standard that varied somewhat in its specific construction details, depending upon the geological conditions of the region and the resources available to the road-building teams, but that always aimed at producing a surface capable of carrying heavy-wheeled traffic in all weather conditions across terrain that would otherwise have been difficult or impassable for loaded vehicles. The characteristic Roman road construction, familiar from the many surviving sections of Roman road that can still be walked or observed across Europe and the Near East, typically involved the excavation of a roadbed, the laying of a foundation of a large flat stone set in mortar, the addition of successive layers of broken stone and gravel bonded with mortar or rammed earth, and the surfacing of the road with carefully fitted stone paving blocks set in a slightly convex profile to shed rainwater to the side ditches. The rivers of the empire, however, were in many respects even more important to the military supply system than the roads, precisely because the transport of heavy bulk cargoes such as grain, olive oil, amphorae, and building materials was so much cheaper and more efficient by water than by road. A single ox-drawn wagon of the Roman period could carry a load of approximately 400 to 500 kilograms on a good road, and required an animal, a driver, and a daily supply of fodder to operate. A medium-sized river barge of the type used on the Rhine and the Danube during the imperial period could carry a cargo of 10 to 15 tons, 25 to 30 times the capacity of an ox wagon, operated by a small crew and driven at least partially by the current of the river itself when travelling downstream. The economic advantage of water transport over road transport for heavy goods was not merely a matter of degree, but of kind, and the Roman military supply system exploited this advantage systematically and thoroughly through the construction and maintenance of dedicated military river fleets on the major frontier rivers. The Rhine frontier was served by the Classis Germanica, the German fleet, which maintained its principal base at Colonia Agrippinensis, the modern German city of Cologne, and operated a network of river transport operations extending from the North Sea coast in the northwest to the upper Rhine Valley in the south, moving grain, oil, weapons, building materials and troops along the river and its tributaries with a regularity and efficiency that was central to the functioning of the Rhine frontier as a military system. The Danube frontier was similarly served by the Classis Pannonica on the upper Danube and the Classis Masica on the lower Danube, each maintaining its own network of river ports, warehouses and supply depots along the riverbank. The combination of these river fleets with the land-based road network created an integrated transportation system of considerable capability, allowing the Roman military administration to move supplies rapidly from their points of production and procurement to the frontier garrisons where they were needed, responding to emergencies, campaigns, and changing strategic situations with a flexibility that was one of the Roman army's most important practical advantages over its opponents. The administrative machinery that operated the supply system at the level of the individual legion was complex and carefully organised, distributed across several specialist officers and administrative functions within the fortress's command structure. The Praefectus Castrorum, the camp prefect, held overall administrative responsibility for the fortress's logistical situation, including the management of the granaries, the armoury, and the various workshops and support facilities. The frumentarii, literally flour men or grain men, were military officers whose duties included the procurement and transport of grain and other supplies, the inspection of supply routes and supply dumps, and various intelligence and administrative functions that expanded considerably over the course of the imperial period until the frumentarii became, in effect, a kind of imperial secret service operating under the cover of their original supply function. The actuarius was the unit's administrative clerk specifically responsible for maintaining the detailed records of ration issues, expenditures, and inventory that were an essential feature of Roman military administration. The extraordinary completeness and detail of Roman military record-keeping is attested nowhere more vividly than in the papyrus documents from Egypt, where the dry climate has preserved military administrative records of a precision and comprehensiveness that modern military historians continue to mine for information about every aspect of military life, including, prominently, the supply and consumption of food. And so, carrying this picture of the supply system in mind, let us turn to the specific daily rhythms of eating within the fortress itself. Mealtimes, daily schedules, and the rhythm of eating in the fortress. The daily rhythm of eating in a Roman legionary fortress was inseparable from the military day itself, organised around the demands of duty rosters, watch schedules, training requirements, and the formal ceremonies of military life in a way that gave the soldiers' eating a structure and a regularity that was both a practical necessity and a reflection of the Roman military's deep commitment to the value of orderliness, routine, and the disciplined use of time. The Roman soldier's day was governed by a rigorous system of timekeeping, organised around the military trumpet calls that mark the passage of the watches and the transitions between the major periods of the day's activities, and within this framework of calls and duties and assemblies, the times and forms of the soldiers' meals were fixed with a consistency that must have been simultaneously reassuring in its predictability and occasionally monotonous in its repetition. The Roman military day formally began with the first light of dawn, marked by the sounding of the tuberson, the military trumpeter stationed at the Principia headquarters building at the centre of the fortress. The dawn call, known in Latin as the Classicum, signalled the formal beginning of the military day and the dismissal of the last night watch, and it was followed shortly by the morning assembly of the sentry on the parade ground, at which the day's duties and assignments were distributed by the centurions and their options. Before the morning assembly and before the formal duties of the day began, the soldier would typically take his first meal of the day, a simple and quickly prepared affair that the scholar of Roman daily life commonly associates with the Latin term ientaculum, the morning meal of the civilian Roman day, though its direct application to the military context involves some interpretive inference beyond what the surviving military sources explicitly state. The morning meal of the legionary soldier was, in practical terms, a matter of expediency. Bread from the previous day's baking, a portion of salt fish, a drizzle of olive oil, and a cup of posca or water constituted the most likely regular content, a combination that required virtually no preparation time and could be consumed quickly before the morning assembly or carried and eaten on the move during the early duties of the day. Hard cheese, when available from the civilian market or from the unit's own dairy arrangements, was another common morning food, as were olives preserved in brine, which were calorie-dense, portable and flavourful enough to make a plain piece of bread considerably more palatable. The total time devoted to the morning meal was probably minimal, perhaps no more than 10 or 15 minutes in most circumstances, and the soldiers seem to have been expected to manage this first eating occasion largely without ceremony or particular organisation. The midday pause in the military day, corresponding roughly to the civilian prandium, was somewhat more substantial in its content and somewhat more formally organised than the morning meal, though it was still very much a secondary event compared to the main evening meal. During garrison duty, a period of reduced activity around the 6th or 7th hour of the Roman day, corresponding to the period around midday or early afternoon in modern terms, provided an opportunity for the soldiers to eat a more substantial meal than the morning ration allowed, and the contubernium's fire would typically be lit and a simple cooked preparation made at this point. Pulse, cooked quickly from the ground grain of the morning's milling, seasoned with salt and olive oil and perhaps enriched with a small quantity of dried or salted fish and a spoonful of garum, was the most likely everyday midday preparation, providing the soldiers with a warm and filling meal that would sustain them through the afternoon's duties and training without requiring the more extended cooking time that the evening meal demanded. The principal meal of the soldier's day, the military equivalent of the civilian cena, took place in the evening, after the afternoon period of duties, training exercises and fatigue parties had concluded, and before the assignment of the first night watch. This was the meal to which the most effort and the most resources were devoted, the meal at which any fresh meat or fresh vegetables that had been obtained that day would be cooked, at which larger quantities of pulse or bean stew or lentil soup might be prepared, and at which the social life of the contubernium found its fullest expression. The preparation of the evening meal was the most extended cooking session of the day, involving the lighting or reviving of the contubernium's fire, the preparation of whatever variety of foods were available, and the shared consumption of the meal in the limited space of the front room of the barrack suite. The social dimension of the evening meal was significant in ways that went well beyond simple nutrition. The 8 men of the contubernium were thrown together by the army's organisational logic into a relationship of enforced intimacy that could, at its best, create bonds of loyalty and mutual care as strong as any family relationship, and at its worst generate tensions and conflicts of the kind that must inevitably arise when 8 individuals of different backgrounds, temperaments, and social origins are required to share a very small space for years at a time. The shared preparation and consumption of the evening meal was one of the primary contexts in which the social dynamics of the contubernium were negotiated, in which grudges were aired or suppressed, in which news from home was shared, in which the day's events were discussed, and in which the 8 men constructed and maintained whatever sense of shared identity and mutual loyalty held them together as a functional unit. The Roman military administration, whatever its precise degree of conscious awareness of this social dynamic, certainly recognized the contubernium as the fundamental building block of military cohesion, and the domestic arrangements it imposed through the design of the barrack blocks implicitly acknowledged the social importance of eating together. And so, fed and settled at the evening fire, let us turn our attention to the special eating occasions that punctuated this daily routine, festivals, feasts, and the special foods of the military religious calendar. The ordered repetitive rhythm of the Roman legionary soldier's daily diet was relieved at regular intervals by occasions of considerably greater variety, abundance, and social elaboration, occasions rooted in the dense and carefully observed religious calendar that governed the ceremonial life of the Roman state, and that the legions maintained with the same thoroughness and seriousness with which they maintained their training schedules and their tactical formations. These festive eating occasions were not peripheral or incidental to the life of the military community. They were central events in the social and religious calendar of the Legion, occasions at which the collective identity of the unit was expressed and reinforced through shared ceremony and shared eating, at which the hierarchy of Roman military society was simultaneously displayed and momentarily softened by the inclusiveness of the communal meal, and at which the soldiers were connected, however distantly and however temporarily, to the broader religious and civic culture of the Roman world from which they had come, and to which they hoped eventually to return. The most important single document for understanding the Roman military religious calendar is the papyrus fragment known as the Feriale Duranum, discovered in the early 20th century at the site of Dura Europos, on the Euphrates frontier in modern Syria, where it formed part of the administrative archive of a Roman auxiliary unit stationed at the garrison. The document, which dates to the reign of the Emperor Severus Alexander in the early 3rd century of the Common Era, provides a month-by-month list of the religious observances to be performed by the garrison throughout the year, specifying the date, the deity or occasion honoured, and in some cases the nature of the ceremony to be conducted. The calendar preserved in the Feriale Duranum includes the birthdays of the reigning emperor and his immediate family members, the dies natalis, the anniversaries of the deification of past emperors, the traditional festivals of the Roman civic calendar adapted for military observance, and specific occasions associated with the army's own divine patrons and traditions. The total number of formally observed religious days listed in the Feriale Duranum amounts to approximately 40 in the surviving portion of the text, suggesting an annual calendar of perhaps 50 or more formal observances, or roughly one significant religious occasion every week on average, a frequency of festive interruption to the ordinary routine that would have given the military year a distinct and carefully articulated rhythm. The most sacred annual event in the life of any Roman legion was the Rosalia Signorum, the festival of the military standards, at which the sacred standards of the legion, the Aquila Eagle standard of pure gold or gilded silver that represented the unit's divine honour and collective soul, the individual sentry standards, and the various other vexilla and signa of the unit's constituent parts. Each were brought out from their shrine in the Principia headquarters building, garlanded with fresh roses and spring flowers, anointed with scented oil, and presented to the assembled legion in a ceremony of solemn and deeply felt collective piety. The military standard was not, for the Roman soldier, a mere piece of ceremonial equipment or an administrative convenience. It was a sacred object of the highest order, the physical dwelling place of the unit's collective numen or divine spirit, and its loss in battle was the deepest possible dishonour, sufficient to prompt years of punitive military campaigns to recover it. As the campaigns of the Emperor Augustus against the Germanic tribes that had captured the standards of the legions of Publius Quinctilius Varus in the Teutoburg forest disaster of the year 9 of the Common Era amply demonstrate. The feast that followed the Rosalia Signorum ceremony was accordingly one of the most generous and most carefully prepared of the military year, and it is entirely reasonable to assume that it involved a significantly more elaborate and more abundant spread of food and drink than the ordinary daily ration. The birthday celebrations of the emperor and the imperial family, listed prominently in the Feriale Duranum, were also occasions for more than ordinary eating and drinking in the legionary fortress. These days were marked by formal parades and religious ceremonies, by the offering of sacrifices on the legion's altars, and by distributions of food and wine that allowed the ordinary soldiers a degree of festive indulgence quite different from the everyday ration. The Roman practice of distributing portions of sacrificed animals to the participants in a religious ceremony meant that any major sacrifice, and the sacrifices associated with imperial birthday celebrations were typically substantial, involving cattle, pigs, or sheep, killed at the legion's altar, resulted directly in the availability of fresh sacrificial meat for a communal meal, a direct and tangible benefit that connected the religious ceremony to the soldiers' eating experience in the most immediate possible way. The donative, the cash gift distributed by the emperor or by a successful commanding general to the soldiers on the occasion of a major victory, an imperial accession, an imperial birthday, or other suitable occasion, was another regular intervention in the financial and therefore nutritional life of the ordinary soldier. Donatives were paid in cash, typically in gold ore or silver denarii depending upon the rank of the recipient, and while they were primarily a financial windfall rather than a food provision, their effect on the soldier's diet was entirely practical. A soldier who received an unexpected cash payment could immediately spend a portion of it in the vicus market on better food, better wine, and whatever small luxuries he had been denying himself during the lean weeks of the normal ration. The donative was therefore simultaneously a political gesture, a financial transfer, and in a very practical sense a dietary supplement, and its effects on the social atmosphere of the fortress in the days following its distribution must have been vivid and immediate. And so, with the festive table still warm in our minds, let us turn now to the very different world of the officer's kitchen and the officer's dining room, the officer's table, from the centurion's hearth to the legate's triclinium. The Roman legion was among the most thoroughly and precisely hierarchical institutions of the ancient world, and in no aspect of daily life was this hierarchy more continuously and more visibly expressed than in the arrangements for food and eating. The gradient between the eating experience of the ordinary legionary soldier at one end of the social spectrum and that of the senatorial legate who commanded the entire legion at the other was not merely a matter of quality or quantity of food, though both of those dimensions were very real and very significant. It was a difference in the entire cultural and social meaning of the meal, in the equipment with which food was served and consumed, in the ceremony and formality surrounding the act of eating, in the social function that the meal was expected to perform, and in the degree to which eating was understood as a private domestic activity, as opposed to a public political one. The centurion, the tribune, the camp prefect, and the legate each inhabited a distinct and carefully calibrated position on this gradient, and each ate accordingly. The centurionate, the backbone of Roman military command, and the stratum of professional career officers who provided the essential continuity and practical expertise of the legion from generation to generation, occupied a position of considerable privilege relative to the ordinary soldiers they commanded, and this privilege was reflected consistently and in multiple dimensions of their daily material life, including prominently their food. The centurion's annual salary, as estimated by modern scholars on the basis of the available papyrological evidence at approximately 3,300 sestertii, or 825 denarii during the Principate period, was approximately 15 times the basic annual pay of the ordinary legionary, a differential that gave the centurion an entirely different relationship to the commercial food economy of the vicus and the civilian market than his men enjoyed. The centurion was expected and culturally required to eat better than his men as a visible marker of his authority and his status, and his quarters in the barrack block, which occupied the end suite of rooms corresponding to a full sentry's accommodation, and were therefore several times larger and better appointed than the individual contubernium rooms, provided him with the physical space for a proper kitchen and a proper dining arrangement that the ordinary soldiers entirely lacked. The centurion's kitchen, staffed by a personal servant or perhaps a slave, prepared food from supplies that included the finest grades of the official ration items, plus whatever additional provisions the centurion chose to purchase from the civilian market, and the food that emerged from this kitchen was recognisably different from contubernium poles in both its ingredients and its preparation. Better quality flour producing whiter and finer bread, olive oil of a better grade with a fresher and more delicate flavour, fresh vegetables purchased from the vicus market or grown in a personal garden plot, including the leeks, cabbage, and onions that were the staple vegetables of the northern frontier diet, as well as, when available, more exotic items brought in by the civilian traders of the vicus. Meat more regularly and in better cuts, prepared with more care and more seasoning than the simple boiling or roasting of the contubernium fire. Wine, rather than posca, as the regular table drink, perhaps not a fine wine of the quality available to the senior tribunes or the legate, but certainly a wine rather than vinegared water. The military tribunes, the 6 officers of equestrian or senatorial background, who served as the senior staff officers of the legion below the legate, occupied a level of the hierarchy at which the organisation of daily eating had moved entirely out of the realm of self-catering communal cooking, and into the realm of a properly staffed domestic household, with dedicated servants, a proper kitchen, and an established routine of meal preparation modelled on the comfortable civilian households from which most tribunes came. The tribunes' quarters in the fortress, typically located in the central range of buildings near the Principia, were spacious and well appointed, and the ceramic tableware associated with officers of this level at excavated legionary sites include substantial quantities of fine red gloss Samian ware, the high-quality mass-produced pottery of the Roman world, as well as glass vessels, bronze serving implements, and other indicators of a dining culture well above the ceramic bowl and wooden spoon of the ordinary soldier. The legionary legate's daily eating experience was, as we have already briefly noted, more closely comparable to that of a wealthy Italian aristocrat dining in a comfortable townhouse than to anything recognisable as military food. The Praetorium, the legate's official residence at the heart of the fortress, was a large colonnaded courtyard house whose design drew directly upon the tradition of the Italian domus, with a proper atrium, a colonnaded garden courtyard, and a formal triclinium dining room of the kind found in every comfortable Roman townhouse of the period. The triclinium was a room of enormous social importance in the Roman aristocratic household, the space in which the host's wealth, taste, and social position were expressed most directly through the elaborateness of the meal, the quality of the tableware, the excellence of the wine, and the distinction of the guests invited to share the table. The legate's triclinium dinner followed the standard Roman aristocratic format of 3 courses, the gustatio or hors d'oeuvres, the prima and secunda mensa or main courses, and the dessert, served on fine ceramic or metal tableware, accompanied by wine of appropriate quality, decanted from its storage amphorae into ceramic or glass jugs, and consumed in the formal reclining posture of the traditional Roman cena. The food served at the legate's table was drawn from the full range of the Roman culinary tradition, as described in sources such as the Apicius cookbook, and it was prepared by trained cooks who were either personal slaves of the legate's household or hired specialists brought from the civilian community. And with the contrast between the soldier's bowl and the legate's triclinium vivid in our minds, let us turn our attention to the remarkable flavouring that was common to both, the garum. Garum, spices, and the deep flavour of the Roman military kitchen. There is something quietly remarkable in the thought that the most distinctive and the most pervasive single flavour of the Roman legionary kitchen was one that modern Western food culture would find almost entirely unfamiliar, a flavour that was simultaneously rich and sharp and deeply savoury, complex in its biochemistry and ancient in its origins, the fermented fish sauce known in Latin as garum. Garum was not a peripheral seasoning used occasionally and cautiously by those with adventurous palates. It was the fundamental seasoning of Roman cooking at every level of society and at every point in the empire's geography, the flavouring added to nearly every cooked preparation. Present at every table from the simplest military contubernium to the most elaborate senatorial dining room, as natural and as unquestioned a presence in the Roman kitchen as salt itself, and in some respects functionally more similar to salt in modern cooking than any single modern seasoning could adequately represent. The production of garum was one of the major food industries of the Roman world, and the physical remains of this industry are among the most clearly identifiable and most extensively studied forms of Roman industrial archaeology anywhere in the Mediterranean basin. The basic production method was consistent across the many different regional variants of the product, though the specific fish species used, the proportions of fish to salt, the duration of fermentation, and the post-production processing of the product varied considerably from one production centre to another, generating the range of different garum products, of different grades, qualities, and flavour profiles that the ancient sources describe. The method involved filling large stone or fired clay fermentation tanks with a mixture of whole small fish or fish offal, typically anchovies, sardines, mackerel, sprats, or a combination of several species depending upon local availability, and coarse salt in a ratio of approximately 1 part, salt to 4 or 5 parts fish by weight. The salted fish mixture was then covered loosely and left to ferment in the warmth of the Mediterranean sun for a period ranging from several weeks to several months, stirred occasionally to promote even fermentation and to prevent the formation of an impermeable crust at the surface. The biochemical process occurring within the fermentation tank during this period was essentially a controlled autolysis, in which the enzymes naturally present in the fish's own digestive organs, released by the death of the fish and activated by the warmth of the environment, progressively broke down the fish tissue, dissolving the proteins and connective tissue into a liquid of extraordinary amino acid richness. The salt inhibited the growth of putrefactive bacteria that would otherwise have produced an simply rotten rather than a fermented product, while the temperature and the activity of halophilic or salt-tolerant microorganisms contributed additional flavour compounds of great complexity. The resulting liquid, drained from the tank through channels at the base or collected from the surface, had an intense, rich, savoury quality described by modern researchers who have analysed its chemistry as essentially an ancient analogue of the umami-rich sauces of East Asian cooking, carrying a depth and complexity of savoury flavour far greater than salt alone could produce, and capable of transforming even the simplest preparation of grain or vegetable into something palatably substantial. The best documented and most extensively studied garum production facilities in the Roman world are located in the coastal towns of Hispania, Ulteria, Baetica, and Lusitania, the southern and western regions of modern Spain and Portugal, facing the Atlantic and the Strait of Gibraltar, where the rich fishing grounds of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean provided an abundant supply of the small pelagic fish that were the primary raw material of the garum industry. The site of Baelo Claudia, located on the Atlantic coast near the modern town of Tarifa in the province of Cadiz, preserves the remains of an extensive industrial fish processing complex dating to the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, including rows of large rectangular stone tanks of precisely the type used for garum fermentation, alongside the remains of the buildings used for processing and packaging the finished product. The individual tanks at Baelo Claudia are impressive in their scale, measuring several metres in length and width, and sufficiently deep to contain many tons of fermenting fish mixture, and the number of tanks in the complex suggests a production capacity of many hundreds of amphorae of finished garum per annual production cycle. For the ordinary Roman soldier, garum arrived in the fortress as part of his official ration, distributed in ceramic containers of modest size suited to the needs of a small group of men over several days. Its use in the contubernium kitchen was entirely practical and entirely integrated into the daily cooking routine. A splash added to the morning pulse, a drizzle over the piece of bread at the midday meal, a generous spoonful stirred into the evening stew of lentils or beans, providing in each case the same essential function of transforming an otherwise rather plain preparation into something more deeply flavourful and more appealing. The Vindolanda tablets include direct references to the purchase of muria, a brine-based fish product similar in its culinary function to garum, by the garrison's officers, confirming the central place of strongly fish-flavoured condiments in the military kitchen's flavour repertoire, even at the most remote northern frontiers of the empire. Pepper, the spice imported from the pepper-growing regions of southern India through the maritime trade routes of the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, deserves particular attention in any thorough account of Roman military flavouring, because its presence in the military zone of the northern frontiers, documented directly by the Vindolanda tablets and indirectly by the broader evidence of Roman commercial networks, demonstrates very clearly that the flavour world of the Roman military kitchen was not limited to local and Mediterranean products, but drew, through the extraordinary commercial reach of the Roman economy, upon the spice-producing regions of the Far East, in ways that gave the Roman soldier access to flavourings that a medieval European peasant 1,000 years later would have regarded as almost incomprehensibly exotic. Honey, herbs of local and Mediterranean origin, dried fruits including figs, raisins and dates, and the various wild plants gathered by soldiers from the countryside surrounding their fortresses, completed the flavour palette of the military kitchen, giving it a range and a complexity that the monotony of the official grain ration might at first suggest was absent. And so, deeply saturated now with the flavours of the legionary kitchen, let us turn our attention to how the different provinces of the empire shaped and varied this culinary world. Regional variation, how the frontiers shaped the soldier's table. One of the most revealing and in some ways most humanising aspects of the Roman legionary diet is the degree to which the apparently universal and standardised framework of the official ration was shaped, supplemented, and given its particular character by the specific environment, climate, and food culture of the region in which a given legion happened to be stationed. The Roman military supply system was indeed capable of moving olive oil from the Guadalquivir Valley to the banks of the Rhine and wheat from the Nile Delta to the forts of Hadrian's Wall, and it did so with remarkable regularity and efficiency throughout the centuries of the empire's functioning. But this long-distance supply was always expensive, always logistically demanding, and always supplemented wherever possible by local procurement, local cultivation, and local commercial exchange, with the result that the soldier stationed in Syria ate in ways meaningfully different from the soldier stationed in Britannia, and the garrison of a desert fort in Egypt had a dietary experience quite unlike that of the legionaries wintering in the forested valleys of the upper Danube. The legions of the Rhine frontier in the provinces of Germania Inferior and Germania Superior were stationed in a landscape that was, by the standards of the Mediterranean world, from which Roman military culture had originally grown, cool, wet, heavily forested, and quite different in its agricultural character and its natural food resources from anything that the designers of the Roman military supply system had originally had in mind. The Rhine Valley itself was fertile and productive, and the provinces of Gaul immediately to the west of the Rhine frontier had been intensively developed agriculturally during the first century of the Common Era, producing grain, vegetables, cattle, and other agricultural products in quantities sufficient to supply the frontier garrisons with a substantial portion of their needs from local sources, rather than requiring everything to be shipped from the Mediterranean. The bone assemblages from Rhine frontier sites reveal a dietary pattern with a particularly heavy emphasis on beef, reflecting the excellence of the cattle-raising conditions in the Rhine Valley and its tributaries, alongside the expected pig and sheep and goat. Beer, brewed from barley, emmer wheat, or a combination of available grains. It was almost certainly the everyday drink of the common soldier on the Rhine frontier, despite the official ration of posca and the cultural prestige of wine in Roman civilian society. The Celtic and Germanic peoples of the Rhine region had a well-established and sophisticated brewing tradition that long predated the Roman military presence, and the Roman soldiers stationed in these provinces would have encountered beer of various kinds from the moment of their arrival, both through the civilian vici surrounding the fortresses and through whatever local procurement arrangements the military supply system made for the garrison's beverages. The Vindolanda tablets, from the closely comparable frontier province of Britannia, on the other side of the North Sea, include direct references to the purchase of Celtic beer, Cerveza Celtica, in a supply document, providing unambiguous documentary evidence that beer of local Celtic type was an accepted and apparently official component of garrison provisioning in the northern frontier provinces, whatever the official ration documents might suggest about the primacy of posca. The province of Britannia, separated from the continental mainland by the Channel and subjected to a climate substantially cooler, wetter, and less amenable to Mediterranean agriculture than even the Rhine provinces, presented the Roman military supply system with some of its most challenging logistical problems, and generated some of its most interesting evidence for dietary adaptation. The legionary fortress of Ibeacum York, the base of the 6th Victrix Legion, and the principal Roman military installation in northern Britannia, was located in the Vale of York, a relatively fertile lowland agricultural district, but the auxiliary forts of Hadrian's Wall and the various outpost forts north of the wall were situated in some of the most agriculturally marginal upland landscape in the entire empire. The botanical evidence from Vindolanda, recovered through the painstaking analysis of the waterlogged deposits in which the famous writing tablets were found, has produced a remarkably detailed picture of the plant foods actually present at the fort, including not only the expected cereals and legumes of the official ration, but also coriander, dill, opium poppy, Celtic bean, and a range of wild-gathered plants including hazelnuts, slowberries, and various species of edible wild green, all of which supplemented the official ration with locally available foods that cost the military administration nothing but the time and effort of the soldiers who gathered them. The province of Aegyptus offers the richest documentary evidence for the regional character of the military diet, thanks to the extraordinary accident of climate preservation that has maintained papyri in the dry sands of the Nile Valley and the eastern desert for nearly 2,000 years in a state of readability that would be impossible in the damp soils of the northern frontier provinces. The military papyri from Egypt, including ration accounts, supply requisitions, and various administrative records from garrison sites scattered across the province, reveal a diet that drew heavily on characteristically Egyptian food products alongside the universal elements of the Roman military ration. Egyptian bread made from emmer or barley, Egyptian beer of the traditional type brewed from partially germinated barley, dried Nile fish of various species salted and dried along the riverbanks, dates and figs from the palm groves of the Nile Valley, lentils and chickpeas grown in the irrigated fields of the delta, garlic and onions, the characteristic flavorings of the Egyptian culinary tradition going back to the Pharaonic period, all appear in the military ration documents alongside the olive oil and garum and posca of the standard Roman military issue. The combination of these characteristically Egyptian foods with the universal elements of the Roman military diet created something that was simultaneously recognizably Roman and distinctively Egyptian, a hybrid food culture that reflected in microcosm the broader hybridization of cultures that the Roman imperial experience produced wherever Roman military power met an indigenous civilization with its own deep and confident food traditions. And so, having explored the geography of the Roman military diet, let us turn at last to the gardens, markets, and civilian world that completed the soldier's daily food experience. Gardens, markets, and the vicus, the soldier's supplementary food world. The official ration of the Roman legionary soldier, however carefully organised and however consistently delivered by the remarkable supply infrastructure of the empire, was never the complete or final story of what the soldier ate. Alongside the grain and the oil and the salt and the preserved fish of the official issue, every permanent legionary fortress existed within a broader food economy of remarkable richness and variety, an economy composed of the soldier's own garden plots, the livestock pens and small farms attached to the fortress's supporting infrastructure, and above all the commercial life of the vicus, the civilian settlement that grew up around every permanent Roman military installation like a second skin, supplying the soldiers with everything that the official system did not provide, and transforming the immediate surroundings of the military zone into a vibrant, noisy, and commercially sophisticated community in its own right. The cultivation of garden plots by Roman soldiers is attested in sources ranging from the agricultural writings of the elder Cato and the agricultural encyclopedist Columella through the military histories of Tacitus and Josephus to the documentary papyri of the Egyptian frontier, and it was clearly not a marginal or exceptional practice, but a recognised and encouraged feature of military life throughout the empire's history. The Roman military regulations governing the use of land within and around the fortress, preserved in fragmentary form in various legal and administrative sources, included provisions for the allocation of garden plots to individual soldiers and units, and the physical layout of some legionary fortress sites suggests the deliberate inclusion of garden areas within or immediately adjacent to the fortress perimeter. The vegetables grown in these plots were primarily those suited to the climate and soil of the particular province, but the most universal and most consistently attested garden vegetables of the Roman military context include cabbage in its various forms, a vegetable of great cultural significance in the Roman food tradition, going back to the austere republican virtues celebrated by the elder Cato, leeks and onions and garlic, turnips and radishes, broad beans and peas, and a range of pot herbs including thyme, fennel, and various species of wild or semi-cultivated aromatic plant. The keeping of small animals for food within and around the fortress was another common practice that supplemented the official meat ration with a more immediately available and more personally managed source of protein. Chickens were kept for both eggs and meat, and the bones of domestic fowl appear consistently in the food refuse deposits of legionary sites, though never in the quantities that would suggest they were a primary meat source. Pigs were kept in the vicus, if not within the fortress itself, using the food waste of the garrison as fodder in the traditional Roman manner, and the management of small pig herds was probably one of the domestic enterprises of the families and dependents who lived in the vicus and who maintained close economic relationships with the garrison. Doves and pigeons, kept in columbaria. The dedicated dove-keeping structures that are attested archaeologically at several Roman sites provided another source of fresh meat that was particularly prized in Roman culinary culture for the delicacy of its flesh, and their keeping within the fortress or its immediate surroundings would have been a relatively easy way to supplement the official ration with high-quality fresh protein. The vicus itself was the most important and the most commercially dynamic component of the soldiers' supplementary food economy, and its role in the daily food experience of the ordinary legionary soldier cannot be overstated. The vici of the Rhine frontier, Hadrian's Wall, and the Danube provinces developed over the decades and centuries of the Roman military presence from simple clusters of temporary trading stalls outside the fortress gates into substantial, and in some cases genuinely urban communities, with permanent stone buildings, paved streets, temples, bathhouses, workshops, and a full complement of commercial establishments catering to every need and desire of the military population. The food establishments of the vicus, which would have included permanent shops selling bread, preserved foods, and basic provisions alongside taverns and eating houses offering cooked meals and wine, formed the retail end of the vast Roman commercial food network, as bringing to the soldiers' immediate neighbourhood a range of food products sourced from across the empire and from the local countryside, that gave even the most remotely stationed legionary access to a far greater variety of food than the official ration alone could provide. The Vindelander writing tablets provide some of the most direct and most evocative evidence for the commercial food life of the vicus and its relationship to the military garrison. Among the hundreds of preserved tablets, several record the purchase of food items by officers of the garrison from civilian suppliers, including a memorandum recording the purchase of pepper, a commodity that implies an active and at least moderately sophisticated commercial network capable of moving Indian spice to the northern frontier of the Roman world. Other tablets record the purchase of Celtic beer, of Muria fish sauce, and of various other provisions beyond the official ration, painting a picture of a garrison community that was commercially active and consumerily engaged with the food economy of its surrounding civilian world in ways that went well beyond simple supplement to the basic ration. The taverns and eating houses of the vicus, whose existence is implied if not always directly documented in the written sources for frontier sites, were almost certainly important social venues for off-duty soldiers seeking variety, company, and the modest pleasure of a meal prepared by someone else and eaten in a setting less institutional than the barrack room. The soldiers' families, who lived in the vicus in informal domestic arrangements that were technically outside the framework of Roman military law, but entirely accepted in practice throughout most of the imperial period, were themselves important participants in the food economy of the military community. The wives and partners of soldiers grew vegetables, kept animals, prepared food, and maintained the domestic routines of households that fed not only themselves and their children, but contributed meaningfully to the daily nourishment of the soldiers to whom they were attached. This informal domestic economy, almost entirely invisible in the official military records and acknowledged only obliquely in the literary sources, was a genuine and significant component of the total food supply of the military community, and its contribution to the quality and variety of the ordinary soldier's eating life was probably considerably greater than the absence of official documentation might suggest. It is a fitting note upon which to conclude our exploration, this reminder that behind the official records and the supply manifests and the administrative tablets lay the entirely human and entirely ordinary reality of people feeding themselves and those they cared for, day after day, in all weathers and all circumstances, with whatever the land and the market and their own industry and ingenuity could provide. If you have found this quiet exploration of the Roman legionary kitchen to be a helpful and restful companion tonight, a gentle like or a share is always very warmly appreciated, and subscribing to the channel helps others who might be looking for exactly this kind of calm and detailed historical content to find their way here. We would be genuinely glad to hear in the comments which historical world you would most like to explore next, whether that is more of ancient Rome, a journey into the medieval monastery, a voyage with the Vikings, or something else entirely from the ancient world. You might also find our other videos on daily life in Rome and on the Roman army a peaceful continuation of tonight's journey. Wherever in the world you're watching from tonight, and whatever hour it is as you settle in, we are truly grateful for your company. Tonight we have moved slowly and carefully through the world of the Roman legionary kitchen, tracing the long and intricate journey of the soldiers' food from the vast grain-producing provinces of Egypt and North Africa and southern Spain, along the roads and rivers of the empire, through the sealed granaries and grinding rooms of the frontier fortress, into the shared cooking fires of the contubernium, and out through the garden plots and vicus market stalls that completed the picture. We have seen how grain was the absolute and unchallengeable foundation of the soldiers' daily diet, ground by hand each morning and baked in the barracks ovens into the bread that sustained 5,000 men through every day of garrison and campaign. We have followed the olive oil from the Andalusian hillsides and the garum from the Atlantic fish processing factories to the soldiers' wooden bowl, and we have traced the remarkable supply infrastructure that made this daily provisioning possible across 3 continents. The history of how human beings fed themselves, organised their food, and found comfort and companionship in the daily act of eating together is one of the most universal stories that history contains, and the Roman soldier grinding his morning grain in the cool grey light of a Rhine frontier's dawn was participating in that same ancient, unhurried human story that connects him to every person who has ever sat down to a shared meal and found in it something more than simple nourishment. We are grateful, as always, for the time and attention you have brought to this corner of the ancient world tonight. We hope these words have been a gentle and steady companion on your way to rest. The legionary fires are burning low now. The fortress is still. Good night, and sleep well.